My husband had been buried less than 2 hours when my mother-in-law leaned close and whispered, "That house belongs to my family now." I was still holding the folded flag. The cemetery at Arlington had been quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees and the soft shuffle of dress shoes on the grass. Colonel Daniel Harper, retired Army. My husband of 21 years had been laid to rest with more dignity than most people get in a lifetime. The honor guard folded the flag so carefully it looked like something sacred. A young soldier handed it to me with both hands. His voice cracked just a little when he said, "On behalf of a grateful nation." I nodded because that was all I could do. Daniel would have hated a scene. He was a man who cleaned his coffee mug before bed, shined his shoes even after retirement, and believed you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated waitresses and janitors. So when Eleanor Harper stepped beside me near the black Lincoln funeral car wearing pearls and no tears, I didn't turn away. She looked at the flag in my arms like it was a receipt. "Margaret," she said softly, "we need to be practical now." I thought she meant casseroles bills, maybe arrangements for family coming in from Richmond. Then she leaned closer. "That house belongs to my family now. So does the business. Daniel would have wanted his bloodline protected." I remember staring at a loose button on her navy coat, one little thread hanging there. Behind her, Daniel's Army friends stood talking in low voices. My sister Ruth was helping someone load flowers into the car. Nobody heard Eleanor but me. I could have yelled. I could have reminded her that I was Daniel's wife, not a guest in his life. I could have said the house in Fairfax had my name on memories she never bothered to make. Instead, I adjusted my grip on the flag and said, "Not today, Eleanor." She smiled like I had just confirmed I was weak. That evening back home, the house felt too large. Daniel's reading glasses were still beside his recliner. His half-finished crossword sat on the kitchen table next to a cold cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to pour out. At 7:15, my attorney Michael Ross came by with a leather folder and a worried look. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Margaret," he said, "Eleanor has already contacted probate counsel." I let out one dry laugh. "Of course she has." Michael opened the folder. "You have every right to fight this. The house, Harper Precision. The estate accounts, none of this is simple, but you're not powerless." I looked at Daniel's chair. Then I said the words that made Michael blink twice. "Let her have it." Michael didn't say another word for several seconds. He simply stared across my kitchen table, waiting for me to explain. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "Margaret, grief makes people do strange things. If you need more time, we can wait before making any decisions." "I've already made one." "You want to surrender everything?" "I didn't say surrender." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Then what are you saying?" I looked toward the family room where Daniel's favorite leather recliner still faced the television. The local news was on mute, flashing stories neither of us cared about anymore. "I'm saying I don't want to fight like Eleanor wants me to." Michael slowly closed the folder. "I've handled probate cases for 24 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen someone this calm after losing both a husband and facing a family lawsuit." "I don't feel calm." That was the truth. The moment he left, I stood in Daniel's closet with one of his old army jackets pressed against my face and cried until my knees hurt from kneeling on the hardwood floor. There wasn't anything strategic about those tears. I simply missed my husband. The following Sunday, I attended First Baptist Church in Fairfax by myself for the first time in over 2 decades. Normally, Daniel would have insisted we arrive 15 minutes early. "Running late is disrespectful," he'd always say while grabbing his truck keys. That morning, I parked alone. People meant well. That didn't make it easier. Mrs. Collins hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I'm praying for you every day." "Thank you." Then came the whispers. "I heard Eleanor already hired a lawyer. Is it true she's taking the company? Are you really letting her have the house?" Small-town gossip spread surprisingly fast even in Northern Virginia. I smiled politely and kept walking. After the service, Daniel's oldest Army friend caught up with me in the parking lot. Frank Donovan had served with him for nearly 18 years. He was 6'3", built like an old oak tree, and still wore his veteran baseball cap everywhere. He crossed his arms. "Margaret." "Frank, you gonna tell me what's going on?" "I wish I knew." He looked straight into my eyes. Dan would have fought. I smiled a little. "No." Frank frowned. He would have prepared. Frank stood there quietly. Then he nodded once. "I suppose you're right." Meanwhile, Eleanor wasted no time. 3 days later, she invited half the Harper family to lunch at the old Brogue Irish pub. By dinner, everyone had heard her version of the story. Margaret knows she can't win. She's finally doing the decent thing. My son built that business. It belongs with his family. Apparently, after 21 years of marriage, I no longer counted as family. Even cousins I hadn't seen in years suddenly felt qualified to discuss my future. One afternoon, my neighbor Linda carried over a peach cobbler. She placed it on my counter. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to," she said gently. "But are you okay?" I laughed softly. "No." She squeezed my hand. I didn't think so. For a while, we simply stood in the kitchen without talking. Sometimes silence is kinder than advice. A week later, Michael called. "The first probate conference is next Tuesday. I'll be there." "Margaret." "Yes?" "If you're still planning to let Eleanor take everything I need to know before we walk into that courtroom." I glanced toward Daniel's workshop behind the house. The lights were off. His old toolbox still sat exactly where he'd left it. "I haven't changed my mind," Michael sighed. "I hope your husband left you something more than courage." After I hung up, I whispered to the empty kitchen. "So do I." The truth was, I wasn't nearly as certain as everyone believed. Every night I lay awake wondering whether I was honoring Daniel's memory or making the biggest mistake of my life. By the time October arrived, people had stopped asking whether I planned to fight Eleanor. They'd already decided I wasn't. In Fairfax, word traveled quickly. By the time I walked into the giant grocery store or picked up my prescription at CVS, someone would tilt their head and give me that same sympathetic smile. "I'm so sorry." "I can't imagine." "You've been through enough." I thanked them every time. None of them knew the whole story. Neither did I. One Monday morning, Michael drove me to Harper Precision Manufacturing in Alexandria. Daniel had asked me to stay involved after he retired from the Army, mostly handling payroll and employee benefits while he focused on running the shop. The company wasn't glamorous. We didn't build missiles or tanks. We repaired precision hydraulic systems used by fire departments, emergency rescue teams, utility companies, and a handful of long-term federal contractors. Daniel often said there was more honor in fixing equipment that saved lives than making headlines. As soon as we stepped inside, the familiar smell of machine oil and fresh coffee wrapped around me. Nothing had changed. Rick, the production manager, hurried over. "Mrs. Harper." "You can still call me Margaret." He smiled weakly. "We've all been wondering, is it true?" I knew exactly what he meant. "Eleanor says she's taking over." Several employees stopped pretending to work. Everyone was listening. I took a slow breath. "The probate case is still ongoing." Rick hesitated. "Are our jobs safe?" That question hit me harder than anything Eleanor had said. These weren't just employees. Many had been with Daniel for 20 years or more. Some were veterans. Others were sons and daughters of men who'd worked here before them. Their mortgages, retirement plans, and children's college tuition depended on this place. "I honestly don't know yet," I admitted. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only honest one. Later that afternoon, Rick walked me through the machine shop. He stopped beside an old CNC milling machine. "You remember when Colonel Harper bought this?" I smiled. "He drove to Ohio himself to inspect it." Rick laughed. "He spent 6 hours arguing over $15,000. Daniel loved negotiating. He wasn't cheap." Rick grinned. "He just refused to waste money." For the first time in weeks, I laughed. A real laugh. It surprised both of us. When I returned home, I found Eleanor's SUV parked across the street. She wasn't alone. A real estate agent stood beside her, pointing toward my house. They were measuring something. My driveway. The front porch. The flower beds Daniel had planted after retiring. I pulled into the garage without saying a word. A few minutes later, my neighbor Linda knocked. "You saw them?" "I did." Linda rolled her eyes. She was telling the realtor she'd probably remodel the kitchen before Christmas. I couldn't help smiling. "She plans fast." Linda looked confused. "You don't seem angry." "Oh, I'm angry." "So why aren't you stopping her?" I looked through the kitchen window toward Daniel's workshop. Because that's what everyone expected me to do. Instead, every evening after dinner, I unlocked the workshop and sat at his old wooden workbench. Not to cry. Not anymore. I started organizing. Military journals. Maintenance logs. Business binders. Tax folders. Old legal envelopes. Daniel labeled everything. Army habit. One binder held service records. Another contained supplier contracts dating back almost 15 years. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I simply wanted to understand the life we'd built together. Some nights I stayed out there until nearly midnight. The radio quietly played old country songs while I sorted papers one folder at a time. A few times I found handwritten notes Daniel had tucked inside. Most were reminders. Call Rick. Renew insurance. Order bearings. Little pieces of an ordinary life. Then one Thursday evening, something slipped from an old green binder onto the floor. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a contract. It was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. I stared at it for a long time. My hand suddenly didn't feel steady anymore. I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. I didn't open the envelope that night. I slid it back into the binder, closed the cover, and carried everything into the house. Some things deserve a clear mind. At my age, I'd learned that bad decisions often came from opening important things after midnight. The next morning I made coffee in Daniel's favorite navy blue mug, even though he wasn't there to drink from it. The habit was comforting in a quiet sort of way. Outside, the maple tree in our front yard had begun dropping orange leaves across the driveway. Daniel used to complain about raking them. Then he'd spend the entire afternoon doing it anyway. I smiled at the memory. Little moments like that still caught me off guard. A few days later, Linda knocked on my front door before breakfast. "You need to come outside." Her voice sounded halfway between annoyed and amused. I stepped onto the porch. Across the street, Eleanor stood with two contractors. One held a clipboard. The other was taking measurements with a laser tape. They weren't looking at her own property. They were looking at mine. More specifically, my backyard. I walked across the lawn. "Morning, Eleanor." She barely looked at me. "Oh, Margaret." One contractor smiled politely. "Ma'am?" Eleanor pointed toward Daniel's vegetable garden. "I'll probably remove all of this." I looked at the tomatoes that were almost finished for the season. Daniel had built those raised beds by hand during his first summer after retirement. "They're difficult to maintain," Eleanor continued. "I prefer open landscaping." I simply nodded. "I'm sure you do." She seemed disappointed that I hadn't argued. By Friday afternoon, another rumor had spread through the neighborhood. Apparently, Eleanor had already ordered new living room furniture. Linda called me. "You'll never believe this." "I probably will." "She's telling everyone she's moving in before Thanksgiving." I stirred a pot of homemade chicken soup while holding the phone against my shoulder. "That's ambitious." "Margaret." "What?" "Why are you so calm?" I looked out the kitchen window. "I'm not calm." "You sound calm." "I've just stopped wasting energy trying to control what other people say." Linda was quiet for a moment. "I wish I could do that." "So do I." Saturday brought another surprise. 3 of Harper Precision's longtime employees showed up at my door carrying donuts from Texas Donuts in Centerville. Rick came with them. "So," he said awkwardly, "we're checking on you." I laughed. "With maple bars. Best medicine we could think of." We sat around my kitchen table for nearly an hour. Nobody mentioned probate at first. Instead, we talked about football, rising grocery prices, aching knees, and the new coffee machine someone had bought for the shop. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Finally, Rick cleared his throat. "Eleanor visited the factory yesterday." I looked up. "What happened?" She introduced herself as the future owner. I felt my stomach tighten. Then, she asked for a list of employees over 60. The room became very quiet. One of the machinists, Carl, folded his hands. "She said younger workers are cheaper." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Rick looked at me. "Colonel Harper would have never treated people like that." "No," I said softly. "He wouldn't." Carl reached across the table and patted my hand. "We don't care who owns the company." He paused. "We care who leads it." After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen thinking about those words. Leadership. Daniel used that word constantly. Not authority, not power. Leadership. That evening, I carried the green binder back to the dining room table. The sealed envelope was still inside. I traced my fingers over Daniel's handwriting. "Margaret, open this when the time feels right." I took a deep breath. Then I carefully broke the seal. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten letter. Daniel had never been one for long speeches. Even after 21 years of marriage, he'd rather fix a broken fence than sit down and talk about his feelings. So seeing 3 full pages in his handwriting immediately made my chest tighten. The first line made me stop breathing for a second. "My darling Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and knowing my mother, she's probably already making your life harder than it needs to be." Despite everything, I laughed. It sounded strange in an empty house. "Still making jokes," I whispered. I kept reading. Daniel wrote about ordinary things first. He reminded me to keep changing the furnace filter every fall because I'd always forget. He told me not to let anyone talk me into replacing his old pickup truck because it still had another 100,000 miles left. Then his handwriting became more serious. You know me well enough to understand that I never walked into an operation without preparing an exit plan. Business isn't much different. I sat back in my chair. Operation. Even after 12 years of retirement, he still thought like an army officer. The next paragraph caught my attention immediately. Michael knows where the important papers are. If something ever feels wrong, ask him to check the blue estate binder, not the green one. I frowned. Blue binder. I'd spent nearly 2 weeks organizing Daniel's office. I remembered a blue 3-ring binder sitting on the very bottom shelf beneath several tax boxes. I walked back into the workshop. There it was, covered in a thin layer of dust. I carried it to the workbench and opened it. Inside were copies of trust documents, corporate records, and legal correspondence dating back almost 8 years. Most of it meant very little to me. One page, however, had a yellow sticky note attached. Michael review every 5 years. I stared at it. Why hadn't he ever mentioned this? Without waiting another minute, I called him. He answered on the second ring. Margaret, I found something. 20 minutes later, Michael was sitting in my dining room with the blue binder spread across the table. He adjusted his reading glasses and began turning pages. The room was completely silent except for the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. 5 minutes passed, then 10. His expression slowly changed. Confusion, curiosity, disbelief. Finally, he stopped reading. He looked at one document, then another. He went back to the first one. No! He whispered it more to himself than to me. What is it? I asked. Instead of answering, he kept reading. His fingers actually trembled. When he reached the final page, he removed his glasses and looked directly at me. Margaret, his voice was different now. Much quieter. Daniel didn't hide anything. I don't understand. He documented everything exactly the way he was supposed to. So, what does that mean? Michael carefully tapped the binder. It means Harper Precision may not belong to Daniel's probate estate. I blinked. What? And if I'm reading this correctly, he paused. Neither does your house. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Outside, a school bus rolled past the front of the house. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Life went on as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. I finally found my voice. So, Eleanor may have spent the last month fighting over property that isn't even part of the estate. Michael gave a slow nod. I need to verify every document before I say anything else. He closed the binder with unusual care. If these records are valid, and they certainly appear to be, the final probate hearing is going to unfold very differently than anyone expects. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about the quiet smile he'd worn every time someone underestimated him. The final probate hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a chilly Tuesday morning at the Fairfax County Courthouse. I barely slept the night before. Not because I was afraid of Eleanor. I was afraid of hope. After weeks of believing everything was slipping away, I suddenly had a reason to think Daniel had protected us all along. That kind of hope can be dangerous. If it turns out to be wrong, the fall hurts twice as much. At 6:30 that morning, I made scrambled eggs I couldn't eat. The coffee grew cold beside my plate. Michael had called late the previous evening. I've verified every document. And they're legitimate. I waited. But we still have to let the process unfold. You're being awfully mysterious. He chuckled softly. I learned from your husband. That made me smile. By the time I reached the courthouse, the hallway outside probate courtroom 3 was already crowded. I recognized neighbors from Fairfax. Several retired veterans from Daniel's American Legion post stood near the entrance. Rick and half a dozen employees from Harper Precision had taken the morning off to attend. Even Linda was there carrying a travel mug that read, "World's Okayest Neighbor." She hugged me. You look calm. I've had practice, she smiled. I've also known you long enough to know that look. What look? The one you get when you've already made peace with whatever happens. I wished she were right. Inside, Eleanor looked as though she were attending an awards banquet rather than a probate hearing. She wore a cream-colored designer suit, a pearl necklace, and a smile that had grown wider every week since Daniel's funeral. Her attorney, Charles Benton, arranged stacks of neatly labeled folders across the counsel table. When Eleanor saw me, she walked over. I hope there are no hard feelings, Margaret. I looked at her for a moment. There should have been fewer hard words. She gave a small laugh. This is simply business. No. I shook my head gently. It stopped being business the day we buried your son. For the first time, her smile faded. only for a second. Judge Helen Whitaker entered promptly at 9. Everyone stood. After the usual formalities, Charles Benton presented Eleanor's claims with polished confidence. He spoke about family legacy, bloodline, generational ownership, responsibility. It was an impressive presentation. Then Michael stood. His entire opening statement lasted less than 2 minutes. We have no objection to the petition as it relates to assets legally belonging to the probate estate. Several people exchanged confused looks. Even Judge Whitaker glanced up from her notes. Charles smiled. He thought we'd surrendered. The hearing continued. One document after another was placed before me. Michael quietly slid each page across the table. You understand what you're signing? I do. I signed. Another document. Another signature. Another. The scratching of my pen echoed through the silent courtroom. From the corner of my eye, I saw Eleanor lean back comfortably. She folded her hands. She wasn't nervous anymore. She believed she'd already won. When the last document reached me, Michael looked into my eyes. You don't have any questions? I trust my husband. Then I signed the final page. A murmur spread through the gallery. Someone whispered. She gave up. Another voice answered. I can't believe it. Charles closed his briefcase with obvious satisfaction. Eleanor actually smiled at me. Not kindly. Triumphantly. Judge Whitaker gathered the signed documents into a single file. She read quietly for nearly a minute. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then, instead of announcing the ruling, she slowly closed the file. She removed her glasses, looked directly at Charles Benton, and said, Counselor, before I rule, I have one question. The room became so quiet. I could hear the courthouse clock striking 10. Nobody spoke. Judge Helen Whitaker rested both hands on the closed file and looked directly at Charles Benton. Counselor, she said evenly, before this court enters a final order, I need clarification. Charles stood immediately. Of course, Your Honor. The judge tilted her head slightly. Did you verify whether every asset listed in your petition is actually part of Colonel Harper's probate estate? The question seemed simple, almost routine. Charles answered without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened a smaller folder that had been sitting beneath the court file. She studied one page, then another. Finally, she looked back at him. Are you certain? For the first time all morning, Charles looked uncertain. He glanced toward Eleanor. She gave him a confident nod. Yes, Your Honor. The judge slowly removed her reading glasses. Interesting. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear someone shifting in the back row. Michael didn't move. He simply folded his hands on the table. Judge Whitaker turned another page. Mr. Benton. Yes, Your Honor. Were you aware that Harper Precision Manufacturing was transferred into the Harper Legacy Trust over 7 years ago? Charles blinked. I'm sorry. The judge repeated herself. The Harper Legacy Trust. Silence. Charles quickly opened one of his binders. He flipped through section after section. Nothing. He reached for another binder. His movements became faster, less controlled. Across the aisle, Eleanor leaned toward him. What is she talking about? He didn't answer. Judge Whitaker continued. And were you also aware that the residence on Willow Creek Drive was conveyed into the same trust during that transaction? My heart was pounding so loudly I wondered whether the people beside me could hear it. Charles looked completely confused. Your Honor, those documents were never presented during discovery. Michael stood. They were recorded with Fairfax County in 2018. He handed a certified copy to the court clerk. The recording information is attached to the final page. The clerk walked it to the bench. Judge Whitaker compared it with the papers already in front of her. She nodded once. They match. A quiet murmur rolled through the courtroom. Rick turned halfway in his seat and looked at me with wide eyes. Linda covered her mouth. Even Frank Donovan looked genuinely surprised. Eleanor grabbed Charles's arm. What is this? He swallowed. I don't know. No? Her voice became sharper. You said everything was part of the estate. Charles lowered his voice. That's what the petition indicated. Michael remained calm. The petition relied on outdated ownership records. Judge Whitaker looked back toward Charles. Counselor, did you independently verify title before asking this court to distribute these assets? Charles didn't answer immediately. I relied on the information provided by my client. The judge nodded slowly. I see. She made one brief note in the margin of the file. Then she looked toward Eleanor. Mrs. Harper, this court cannot distribute property that is not legally owned by the estate. Eleanor's confident smile disappeared completely. She looked from the judge to Charles, then finally toward me. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she looked frightened. I wish I could say I enjoyed it. The truth is, I mostly felt tired. Weeks of gossip, sleepless nights, watching strangers speculate about my marriage, watching loyal employees fear for their jobs. None of that could be erased by one moment in court. But Daniel had once told me something while we were repainting our porch. Truth doesn't always arrive first, he'd said. Sometimes it takes the long road. As I sat there listening to the silence inside that courtroom, I realized the truth had finally caught up. Nobody left the courtroom. Not the employees, not the neighbors, not even the reporters who had wandered in after hearing there was a dispute involving a well-known local business. Everyone seemed to realize they were watching something unexpected unfold. Judge Whitaker turned another page in the trust documents before looking back at Michael. "Mr. Ross, please explain the Harper Legacy Trust for the record." Michael stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He walked to the evidence table and picked up the blue binder Daniel had prepared years ago. Colonel Daniel Harper established the Harper Legacy Trust in June of 2018. It was reviewed amended when necessary and properly recorded with Fairfax County. He paused long enough for everyone to absorb that. The trust became the legal owner of Harper Precision Manufacturing. Charles Benton finally found his voice. "Your Honor, ownership may have transferred, but Mrs. Harper should still control the trust." Michael calmly shook his head. "No." He handed another document to the clerk. "The trust has 3 co-trustees." Judge Whitaker read their names aloud. "Margaret Harper." She looked up at me briefly. "Richard Coleman." Rick nearly fell out of his chair. "And Veterans Community Foundation of Northern Virginia." The room filled with quiet murmurs. Rick whispered, "Me?" I nodded. "I didn't know either." Daniel had never mentioned it. Michael continued. "The trust requires unanimous approval from all 3 trustees before the business can be sold, dissolved, or relocated." Charles frowned. "So Mrs. Harper can't simply sell the company?" "No one can," Michael answered. "Not without meeting the conditions Colonel Harper established." Judge Whitaker looked impressed. "What conditions?" Michael smiled for the first time that morning. "The company must continue operating in Northern Virginia." Several employees exchanged relieved glances. "It must maintain its veteran hiring program." Frank quietly whispered, "That's Dan." "And no fewer than 80% of its full-time employees must be retained during any ownership transition." Carl let out a breath so loudly that several people laughed. Even the judge smiled. "So," she said, "Colonel Harper intended to protect both the business and the people working there." "Exactly, Your Honor." Eleanor was no longer sitting comfortably. She leaned toward Charles. "There has to be something." He didn't answer. She grabbed his sleeve. "There has to be." Charles spoke carefully. "The trust appears valid." "Appears?" "I need to review it further." Judge Whitaker looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Harper, regardless of how you feel about these arrangements, this court cannot disregard legally executed trust documents." Eleanor slowly shook her head. "My son would never cut me out." Michael's voice remained respectful. He didn't. Everyone looked toward him. "The trust provides Mrs. Eleanor Harper with a one-time distribution of $50,000. Eleanor blinked. "50,000? Michael nodded. "Colonel Harper also wrote a personal letter explaining why." Judge Whitaker looked surprised. "A letter." Michael handed it to the clerk. It was attached to the trust. The judge read silently for nearly a minute. When she finished, her expression softened. "I'm not going to read this aloud," she said. "It was clearly intended as a private message." She folded the letter carefully. "But I will say this." She looked around the courtroom. "Colonel Harper devoted considerable thought to ensuring his family, his employees, and his community were all cared for after his death." No one spoke. The silence felt different now. Peaceful. Purposeful. The judge signed several orders before closing the file one final time. "The claims seeking ownership of Harper Precision Manufacturing and the residence on Willow Creek Drive are denied." Her gavel struck once. "Those assets are not part of the probate estate." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. When the hearing ended, nobody rushed for the exit. People stayed where they were, almost as if they needed a minute to process what had just happened. Eleanor remained seated. She wasn't crying. She simply stared at the table in front of her. Charles Benton quietly packed his files without saying a word. Michael gathered our documents and looked over at me. "You all right?" I nodded. "I think so." "You don't sound convinced." I smiled. "I've been carrying this weight for weeks. It feels strange not to have it anymore." He understood. Some victories don't make you want to celebrate. They just let you breathe again. Outside the Fairfax County Courthouse, the autumn air felt cooler than it had that morning. A group of local reporters had already gathered near the courthouse steps. One recognized Eleanor immediately. "Mrs. Harper." She stopped walking. "Do you have a comment on today's ruling?" She glanced toward Charles. He quietly shook his head. Another reporter stepped forward. "Did you know the company wasn't part of the estate?" No answer. A third asked, "What happens now with Harper Precision?" Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, she didn't seem to have anything to say. The reporters soon turned toward me. A young woman holding a microphone smiled politely. "Mrs. Harper, many people expected a long legal battle. Instead, today's hearing ended very differently." "How do you feel?" I thought about the question. Then I answered honestly, "Relieved." "Do you consider today's outcome a victory?" I looked across the parking lot where several Harper Precision employees were waiting. Rick, Carl, Melissa from accounting, Tom from shipping. People Daniel had trusted for years. "I think my husband would be happy." The reporter nodded. "And your mother-in-law?" "I truly hope she finds peace." Michael glanced at me with a small smile. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. As we walked toward the parking garage, Rick caught up with us. He looked like a man who had just escaped a tornado. "I still can't believe Colonel Harper made me a trustee." "Neither can I," he laughed. "You know what the first thing everyone asked me was, what? Are we all keeping our jobs?" And Rick grinned. I told them yes. He paused. "Margaret, thank you." I frowned. "For what?" "For never treating us like we were just employees." I felt my throat tighten. "Daniel taught me that." "No." Rick shook his head. "He showed you. You chose to live it." The following Monday, I visited Harper Precision for the first time since the hearing. The mood inside the shop had completely changed. Machines hummed. Forklifts moved across the warehouse. Someone had brought in donuts. Someone else had started a fresh pot of coffee. It felt alive again. Carl walked over carrying a cardboard box. "We found something in Colonel Harper's office." Inside were dozens of handwritten thank you notes Daniel had written over the years. Birthday cards, retirement congratulations, notes thanking employees for staying late during snowstorms. One envelope had never been mailed. It was addressed simply, "To whoever leads this company after me." Rick looked at me. "You should read it." I carefully unfolded the letter. It wasn't about profits. It wasn't about contracts. Daniel had written only one sentence. "Take care of the people and the business will take care of itself." I smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." Rick laughed. "That's because nobody ever won an argument with the Colonel." We both laughed. For the first time since his funeral. The laughter didn't hurt. It felt like he was still leading us. Just in a different way. Winter arrived quietly that year. By December, the maple tree in the front yard had dropped its last leaf, and the mornings in Fairfax carried that familiar bite of cold that makes you pull your coat a little tighter. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after the court hearing. Real life never works that way. There were insurance forms to finish, accountants to meet with, and more trust paperwork than I ever imagined possible. Every Tuesday afternoon, Rick and I met in Daniel's old office to review company reports. At first, I felt out of place sitting behind his desk. Eventually, I realized I wasn't replacing him. I was protecting what he had built. The employees noticed the difference. Nobody worried about losing their job anymore. Instead, they started bringing ideas. One suggested updating the break room. Another wanted to expand the apprenticeship program for veterans returning to civilian life. By spring, we welcomed our first 3 apprentices. One had served in Afghanistan. Another had spent 20 years in the Navy. The youngest had recently left the Army after 8 years as a mechanic. Watching them walk through the shop reminded me of Daniel. He always believed experience should be passed on, not locked away. A few weeks before Memorial Day, I received an unexpected letter. The return address belonged to Eleanor. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No lawyer. No demands. No accusations. Just a short note. "Margaret, I spent so much time trying to hold on to what Daniel owned that I forgot to appreciate who he was. I can't change what happened. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you." There was no request for forgiveness. No excuse. Only those few sentences. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same blue binder that had changed everything. Some apologies don't erase the past, but they can keep bitterness from following you into the future. On Memorial Day morning, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery carrying fresh white roses. The grounds were peaceful. Rows of marble headstones stretched farther than the eye could see. I found Daniel's grave without looking at the map. I always could. I knelt, brushed a few leaves away from the base of the stone, and placed the flowers beside it. For a while I simply stood there. No speeches, no tears, just gratitude. "I finally understand," I said quietly. "You weren't protecting the money." A gentle breeze moved through the trees. "You were protecting the people." That had always been Daniel's mission. The house was never just a house. The company was never just a business. They were places where lives had been built, friendships had grown, and families had found stability. His greatest legacy wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the people who were still standing because he had cared enough to plan ahead. As I walked back toward the parking lot, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer wanted revenge. Justice had already done its work. What remained was peace. And after everything that had happened, peace felt like the greatest inheritance of all. If this story reminded you that kindness, patience, and integrity can outlast greed, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope you'll join me again for another story. The end.